Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. My guest, Kathryn Spink, is a highly respected, award-winning author and translator. Born in India and living now in England, Kathryn is the author of several acclaimed authorized biographies on the works of Mother Teresa, the Indian-Albanian Catholic nun and founder of the Missionaries of Charities. Kathryn has also authored books on Brother Roger of Taizé, France, and Bede Griffiths, who was a British-born priest and Benedictine monk who lived in India, both who worked in service of those in need and who pursued lives of inner peace and happiness. Ms. Spink's first publication, which garnered quite a bit of attention, was titled Invitation to a Royal Wedding, featuring Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer's wedding and courtship details. For decades, Kathryn has surrounded herself with seekers drawn to help the most vulnerable and by those on the path to living a life of clarity and spirituality. She joins us today from England to share stories of her mother Ruby and those of St. Teresa of Calcutta, otherwise known as Mother Teresa. Kathryn Spink, welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
You are joining us via Zoom, and you're in a remote area of England, so I know Mother Teresa is going to watch over us, and your mom, Ruby's going to watch over us to make sure the technical aspects of this interview work.
We can but hope so.
So I would like to start off to hear, because this life of yours, you lived in Vienna after being born in India, and you went to Oxford, you've spoken at the UN, you're extremely well educated and well versed in all the different aspects of life. What was it about your mother that helped you become who you are today? Or was she a part of why and how you became who you are today?
Well, my mother, like Mother Teresa, had quite a profound spiritual experience while she was very young. And she too felt called to go out to India. And certainly that indomitable commitment to the poor and to her religious faith had some effect on me. I remember as a child smelling India in a trunk that my parents had brought back from India. And by that, I mean incense and a snake skin and all kinds of miscellaneous souvenirs of India, if you like. And I, too, seemed to feel called in that direction. So there are certainly some influences of my mother in me.
Your mother is English?
Yes, she was, yes.
And your father?
He too was English, and they married essentially because they shared this vision of going out to India, spreading the gospel message, and serving the poor.
Do you have siblings?
No, I'm an only child. My mother, unfortunately, had TB while she was in India. She was living such a poor life. And as a consequence, she lost 2 children before she was pregnant with me, and another baby shortly after me. And it was because she had previously had 2 miscarriages that she was sent up to a hill station in the Himalayas when she found that she was pregnant with me, because it was felt that it would be beneficial to her health.
Do you have childhood memories of going out with your mother and father to communities and different facilities to help people in need? Was that something that's part of your early childhood memories?
I don't recall actually being actively involved in any way. By the time I was conscious of people's needs, if you like, we were living in Vienna, and it was under the communist regime in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, as it was then, that people were suffering and were seeking refuge in Vienna. And I do remember my parents taking in refugees and them sleeping on our living room floor, waiting to find out whether they would be granted political asylum. So that left a very profound impression on me. But it wasn't really until much later, when I first encountered Mother Teresa, and subsequently Dominique Lapierre, whose book City of Joy I translated, that I went out to India and felt called then to do the little that I could to help the poor there.
Growing up in Vienna with your mother, what was that experience like? Were you inseparable? Was she fiercely independent and wanted you to be independent? Did you have a warm, fuzzy relationship with her? Uh-oh. Here we go.
Here we go. My mother belonged to the same generation as Mother Teresa. Tough women, actually, strong women, and not particularly fuzzy, as you call it. At the same time, I felt very loved, I have to say. And my mother, like Mother Teresa, had been a teacher. And for some years, she taught me and other children from the embassy who were too young to go away to school. So I had her as a teacher, and she was very determined that as an only child, I should not be spoilt. So she was quite strict, but always with this underlying communication of great warmth, I suppose. And at 13, I went away to boarding school because my parents were moving around so much that it was felt it would be better for my education if I came to England.
And was it you had your studies and your music lessons and your dance lessons? Was it regimented days, completely occupied to be the best that you could be? Or was it...
What, at an English public school? Yes, every minute of the day was regimented, but it was a very good school, actually. Academically, it was ahead of its time. The headmistress had been a forceful woman in her own right. She'd driven across the Sahara on her own and was quite a character. She invariably had a parrot on her shoulder and King Charles Spaniel at her heel, which would bite you around the ankles if you ever had to go and visit headmistress.
Have you ever gone back there? Does the school still exist?
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, Samantha Cameron, you know, David Cameron, one of our previous prime minister's wives,
yes,
went to the same school more recently than me, of course. Yes, I've been back. We went back when we'd all turned 40 and had a bit of a reunion. And
it's remarkable how all our past experiences, now we can laugh about it, but when you were probably living there, it may be at times not exactly ideal, but it does shape us for better or worse, all of our experiences.
I mean, it was a staunchly Anglican school, and we went to chapel once a day. And so, yes, the foundations of some form of religious faith were certainly laid. You know, whether you resisted them or went along with them was a different matter, but they were deeply ingrained in you.
Yeah. So your parents, you went to boarding school, your parents were off working, doing what?
By this time, my father was chaplain to the British embassies. So a very different kind of life, rather privileged in all sorts of ways. And then he came back as a canon of Coventry Cathedral, which at that time was a very modern cathedral. It had just been built. And its special emphasis was reconciliation. It had a strong link to Dresden in Germany, and the idea being that following the war, all kinds of efforts should be made to establish unity. So, again, a certain influence there.
What would you like to say to your mother today?
Sorry?
Why sorry? Did you disappoint her? I can't imagine that was disappointment. Or sorry, why? You tell me.
I think in her latter years, when she lived with us for some 30 years, I might say, with my husband and me, she became quite difficult to, well, her acceptance of her lack of independence became quite difficult to manage, I think. Non-acceptance, I should say. And I was probably not as patient as I should have been. You know, she was 102 when she died and was still a force to be reckoned with mentally, but she suffered all the frustrations of the physical limitations of age. And I think I should have been more patient. So I owe her an apology for the last years of her life, I think.
Well, 30 years for someone to have their mother living with them is, I would say, right up there at the top. It's pretty admirable.
Well, Mother Teresa approved anyway.
Now that brings me to an interesting question. I'm curious. Mother Teresa was demure. She was very tiny, correct?
Yes.
But she must have been a force of nature. I'm curious, did she ever put her hands on her hips and say, I want this, this, and this, and this, and I'm not going to accept anything else? Or was she the saint that we all think of her as, you know, as she's portrayed as?
Well, she could be a tough cookie, to put it in the vernacular, if you like. She was difficult to deal with sometimes because God was so definitely on her side. You know, when somebody is absolutely confident that what she is doing is the will of God, then that is not always easy to deal with for some people. She could certainly admonish her sisters. She treated them very much like her children. I don't know. She would write letters telling them off, but always signed at the end, Mother wants you to be Christ-like, and Mother loves you and is encouraging you for that reason. Did your mother ever meet Mother Teresa? No, she didn't, which is rather a shame, actually, because they were in India at about the same time. Well, Mother Teresa in 1948 stepped out into the slums, and that was the year my mother went out to India. And she was working not very far from Calcutta, but never actually in it. Mother Teresa worked all over. She didn't just stay in India, right? She was in Beirut. She was in many different countries helping the needy. You mentioned Beirut, and in fact, while she was in Beirut, she took charge from a contingent of aid workers, and one of the people in charge of the aid work likened her to a cross between a military commander and St. Francis of Assisi. If that should give you. I love that story. That's what made me wonder. She was just this force, but when you say her faith was so strong, that's all that was possible, was that 100+% of giving. She didn't even think about it, right? That's all that was going to be acceptable. Yes, and I think it took its toll on her, certainly. I mean, there were times when she was totally exhausted, but this was a sacrifice that she made for God. And the solution was always prayer. And I have never seen anyone so obviously energized by prayer as Mother Teresa. I remember once seeing her going into the chapel, absolutely exhausted at the end of the day, because she'd been up since 4:30 and working amongst the poor ever since. And she was due to receive an ambulance from Rajiv Gandhi. She went into that chapel, tiny, exhausted, barely able to move. 15 minutes or so later, she came out completely re-energized and a good couple of inches taller, ready to attend a public ceremony.
Her meditation completely empowered her. Minute by minute, she was asking God for the reinforcements, I would imagine, to keep her healthy and strong and positive and always moving in the direction that she felt that she was most called.
Absolutely. And that was what took her all over the world. I mean, the call of the poor, in whom she identified Christ, the suffering Christ. And whatever form that suffering or poverty took, she felt obliged to respond to it. So you get this kind of mystical vision behind her life, which was Christ offered on the altar to sustain, and at the same time, Christ crying out for sustenance in the poor.
Did she ever get mad at Christ? Why is this happening? Why are you doing this to these innocent children and people who are suffering from AIDS or leprosy or any disease?
No, I think poverty saddened her. I don't think it angered her. Certainly not in relation to God. I think there were times when she was angered, mainly by waste, actually. It was the wastefulness of some societies that could make her angry, but not with God. She had this dark night of the soul when she experienced this sense of alienation from God, but that generated sadness, not anger.
What would be an example of her feeling alienated from God?
Well, for a long time, it would appear that she felt a certain dryness in prayer. And she wrote letters to her spiritual directors and to various bishops, which only came to light after her death. And in it became apparent, in those letters, it became apparent that she was not experiencing the same kind of direct relationship that she had once had with Jesus. And having had that experience on the train in 1946, what she described as the call within a call, when Jesus would appear to have spoken to her in some form and called her into the dark holes of the slums, as she described it. And having had that, the feeling that she was not in quite the same way connected to Jesus was a great trial to her.
Yet she kept on. She never gave up.
No, she persevered, and that is enormously to her credit. But at the same time, you see, she was experiencing the presence of God in the poor. And as I said earlier, in the Eucharist and through prayer, at a certain level, but not in this quite the same way that she had done during that very privileged period of the call within a call.
Did you ever see her speaking to non-believers, and I'm not necessarily speaking of the sick and those that were in need, but did she ever have political discussions or discussions with people who didn't believe in Christ or Jesus or religion or faith? How would she handle something like that? Or didn't she? Didn't stand for it, or?
No. I mean, that tolerance was deeply ingrained, and this was something that came from her own mother, actually. She believed that God was at work in every human soul, and that it was not for her necessarily to know quite how. She had profound respect for people of other faiths. She wanted, she said, to make a Hindu a better Hindu, a Muslim a better Muslim, a Roman Catholic a better Roman Catholic, an Anglican a better Anglican, and so it went on. But if you were struggling to believe, or not a believer at all, again, there was this very practical aspect of her life to which many, many people responded, and that was seeing her at work with the poor. And if people didn't understand, the first thing she would say is, "Come to Calcutta and I put you to work." That was initially. And then she began to realize that actually the poverty of the West was in some ways much more acute and much more complex, much more difficult to solve than the poverty of the so-called third world. And so it was spiritual poverty that she focused on, but she understood that faith was at its most articulate in practice rather than through words. Words had the potential to divide, whereas silence and actually tending to the poor tended to speak to people of all faiths and none.
Mother Teresa touched people's lives in over 100 countries, whether it was soup kitchens or orphanages or schools, people with HIV/AIDS or leprosy, tuberculosis, and this is just scratching the surface of all that she accomplished. Her faith was undeniably unshakable, just unshakable. I know that Mother Teresa was very upset about the waste, especially in the Western world, where she could certainly use some of that aid where she was in India. But she was a force to reckon with, for sure. She took on a lot for that little body, huge heart, but a little body.
Well, we come back to her being the little pencil in God's hands, as she always described herself, that she was just the instrument of something very much larger and greater. And, concern, she always said, was the practical expression of God's love. And so, yes, without her faith, I'm sure she could not have accomplished anything like what she did. And of course, her faith came from her own mother.
I believe her mother gave to others similarly, though I don't know all the facts.
Her mother was widowed when Agnes was just, Agnes being Mother Teresa's childhood name, when Agnes was just 9 years old. And so she was definitely a force to be reckoned with. She was a strong woman and had a very strong influence on Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa's mother used to say, "Home is where the mother is." And that's exactly what Mother Teresa would say in later life. She emphasized the importance of family life, particularly in the West, where sometimes quite often it breaks down so tragically. And Drana, that's Mother Teresa's mother, was very much a traditional homemaker. And as a widow, she was very enterprising. She set up an embroidery and clothes selling business. She was serious-minded. She didn't approve of silly talk or time wasting. In fact, there's quite a nice story about how Agnes and her two siblings were on one occasion talking in the evening, and the talk had become rather silly, and her mother didn't approve, so she simply turned off all the electricity and said, so you get the impression that here was a tough lady, and but at the same time, Drana became known with the family as Nana Loke, which Nana meaning mother and Loke meaning soul. So Nana Loke could be translated as mother of my soul. She was very devout. She used to say, the family that prays together stays together. And again, that's an axiom which Mother Teresa would later frequently cite.
Right, so the fruit didn't fall far from the tree.
Not at all. And also Drana expressed her faith in a very concrete way. She took in the sick. She took in anyone who was in need of a meal. In fact, there was always quite a number of guests at the family table. And you can imagine the children asking who these people were. And on one occasion, she said, well, some of them are our family, but they are all our people. And so hospitality, sharing, and care of the sick. I mean, Drana went out to look after all the sick in the neighborhood. And one woman in particular who was covered in sores and was suffering, but suffering primarily because her family had abandoned her. And again, this is something you find in Mother Teresa in later life, that it's not always about the physical suffering. It is also this business, this whole process of being abandoned by people, and the importance of not dying without feeling that you were loved, and
a baby being held.
And to give someone who was dying your hand, or just give them water. It wasn't always about palliative care as we understand it. It was more about showing them that they were loved and would be missed and were important.
Or even acknowledging their existence, right?
Exactly.
And It's such simple philosophy, and it doesn't matter whether this was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It's still appropriate, and we should be aware of this today. And,
Absolutely.
We have these boundaries up. Walk down the street, and I'm saying hi to everybody, and no one responds. I mean, it's like, wow, there's more to life than our technology, and it's human nature. We have to hang on to that, because that's all we have is each other, when it comes down to it.
One of the things that always strikes me when I come back from India is how little people here in England smile. It's precisely what you say. You try and smile at people, and they're either looking at their phones or they're looking past you.
I'm curious, what language did you speak to Mother Teresa in?
English, I'm afraid.
English. And how many languages did she speak?
Well, she managed to maintain her knowledge of Albanian and Serbo-Croatian, Bengali and Hindi, and obviously English, which she made the language of the order because I think she knew from the earliest days that it had the potential to spread throughout the world.
Her desire to reach the world was limitless. But the most important thing, I guess, is to just start with acknowledging or accepting one person at a time. My guest, Kathryn Spink, thank you so much for joining us this week on Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Well, thank you so much.
We were able to uncover 3 unique mothers in just one episode. That is pretty great. If you're interested, Kathryn Spink, S-S-A-M-P-I-N-K, has many books about Mother Teresa and other healers and spiritual leaders. It's kind of interesting to take a read and find out more of all that Mother Teresa accomplished in her life and all that's continuing today. regardless if she's here physically with us or not. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother.